Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our weekly Pirkei Avos class. Today we are going to study a section of chapter 2 of Pirkei Avos. Today's class will be a little bit different because I'd like to focus on personalities, a little bit on history today. I also want to dedicate today's class to the neshama of my grandfather, Dovber ben Naftali Cohen. That's my father's father. Today happens to be his yahrzeit. So dedicate to the aliyah of his neshama. Like to follow along in the siddur, in the blue siddur, in the Pirkei Avos. Today's Mishnah can be found on page 275. Here you go, Steve. That's 275. All right. Let us read the Mishnah with the basic commentary, and then we will discuss the historical significance of the characters that we are talking about, or the sages, I should say, is probably a better word. I once heard that if you were to, we just finished the presidential elections, which is always an interesting time, shall we say? And hopefully, I'll say something now that I won't offend anyone. That if you are to ask who are the best presidents in United States history, the consensus comes back to two names, and those are Abraham Lincoln, correct, and George Washington. Those are generally considered to be one and two, whichever order you choose, the greatest leaders we've had. And what's interesting about those leaders is that there's a common denominator, which is that they led the nation through a very challenging period. So George Washington was the leader at the very beginning, which is, right after the Revolution. And then you have Abraham Lincoln, who led the nation through the Civil War. And perhaps it could be said that maybe there were other leaders which were just as capable and had the same qualities, but perhaps they just didn't live in adverse times. Maybe the times they lived in were calmer times, so we don't necessarily appreciate their leadership because they didn't have to exert that level of great leadership. That's a possibility. I'm just saying a suggestion. And I think that concept that perhaps the greatest leaders are those who lead us through challenging times. Obviously, there's challenges in all times, but sometimes are pivotal times in human history. The same can be said about Jewish history. Is that while we have a statement from the I think it's from the Zohar, which says that every generation has a ispashtusa de Moshe. Every generation has a extension of Moshe Rabbeinu. So every generation has a neshama that's really has the energy, the power of Moshe. That being said, there are some leaders which stand out among others throughout Jewish history, and often it's because these are leaders who led the Jewish people through some of its most challenging times. So a name like Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe led us out of Egypt. That would be lahavdil, not to compare, but like George Washington, the beginning of the people. Yehoshua, Joshua, led us into the land of Israel. You have Ezra, who led us back to the land of Israel to help rebuild the second temple. And the same can be said to a degree about the person and the people we'll talk about today, specifically Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his students. But let's start with what the Mishnah says about them, and then we can move on to the commentary and the history of it. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Perek Beis Mishnah Ches. Perek Beis, Mishnah number 8. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Kibel Mehillel v'Shamai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai received from Hillel and Shammai. Okay, even before we move on, I want to pause here because that's very significant. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai received from Hillel and Shammai. Why is that remarkable? What comes to mind when you hear those words? It's both of them. How could it be both of them?
Right.
We have
They're so different.
I'm sorry?
They're so different in their teaching.
They're so different in their teaching. Philosophically, they're different. practically they were different. There have been different rulings, and you have what's known as base. We often hear of base Hillel and base Shammai, which basically means the house of Hillel, the yeshiva of Hillel, and the yeshiva of Shammai. And they were two different yeshivas with two different approaches, with two different halachic rulings. And the Talmud doesn't necessarily talk about it in great detail, but there was some very serious disagreements and contentious disagreements between them. So it's remarkable to hear of Yochanan ben Zakkai having received from Hillel and Shammai. Furthermore, as the Tosfos Yom Tov points out, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did not live in the generation of Hillel and Shammai. He lived later. He lived much later than that. Yochanan ben Zakkai was, if anything, was after that. So the answer is, and it's if we that by saying he was the student of Hillel and Shammai, it's explaining his quality. It's talking about his greatness, that he was able to draw wisdom and to be aware of the Torah of both Hillel and Shammai. And that's why it doesn't matter that he's not the actual student. It's the point they're making, is that obviously the path of Hillel and the path of Shammai still existed. And in order for one to be a leader like Yochanan ben Zakkai was, and to, as we're going to point out, reestablish Torah after the destruction of the temple, you need to be able to be a receiver and then a giver of the wisdom of the sages that came before you, even those that disagree with one another. And that's what made him the great leader he was, is that he was able to receive from both. And maybe, if I'm to apply that to today's day and age, we have a problem. Again, we're still in the midst or in the immediate aftermath of a very political time. And unfortunately, often we become entirely committed to one side, one party line. And it's almost like a faith. We are absolutely, this is my party this is the group that I connect to, the political side that I affiliate with. Therefore, I am wholeheartedly committed to that and to whatever ideas they share. And the ideas that come from the side that I don't vote for, I don't agree with, are patently false. There's nothing there must be, everything that comes from them is ridiculous, is absurd, can't be even a kernel of truth there. And that's unfortunately what we see often the case right now. And while there's, obviously I'm not saying the Hillel and Shammai are the same as today's two political sides, but the underlying message is the same, is that to be a true leader, to have true wisdom, one has to be able to find the wisdom and the truth in both sides. And there is wisdom, and there is truth, and there is goodness, and there is compassion on both sides of most issues. Not in all issues. I'm not, I don't want to make this blanket statement that moral equivalence in every single issue and every single disagreement. There is at times a side that is good and a side that is evil. That can exist. But I don't believe that's the case when it comes to major, political disagreements in our country. I don't believe one is absolute good and one is absolute evil. One may be more good than the other. That's why you choose one over the other. But the ability of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says you can learn from Hillel and Shammai. And again, even though Hillel and Shammai are both the words of Hashem, so again, I want to clarify. I'm not saying that that's the same as what I'm comparing it to, but nonetheless, there's truth to be found even in the opinions that you may disagree with. Let's put it that way. Anyway, so this is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Hu haya omer. What was the statement? What was it that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would say? And as we said, Hu haya omer, we said throughout Pirkei Avos, it means that even though we're talking about people who taught throughout their lives, and they shared wisdom, there's books of wisdom that they shared, but there are certain statements that they said again and again. And the statement that he said, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but what he said was, "Im lamadet Torah harbe," if you studied a lot of Torah, if you studied lots of Torah, al tachzik tova la'atzmecha. Don't be too excited about yourself. even though you've studied a lot of Torah. Because that's why you're here. If someone hires you to do a job and you do the job, all right. I mean, so you're happy you did the job. You can't walk around, strut around with the sense of arrogance that you've somehow you've accomplished something tremendous which deserves honor. After all, that's why you're here. You did the job that you're supposed to do. And basically it says, even if you learn a lot of Torah, a person still has to maintain a level of humility, because that is the only reason you're here, and therefore you don't deserve any extra accolades. You don't get extra credit. You did well, very good. That's what you're here for. You did your job, as we say, kol hakavod, or yeshakov, or chazaku baruch, whatever it is, and that's it. So he basically says it's important to maintain a sense of humility, even if one studies a lot of Torah. And the reason why Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai has the right to say this, and why it's perhaps very remarkable that he says it, is because in Masechah Sofrim, which is one of these relatively unknown Masechtas Talmud tractates, it's called, it talks about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And one of the things it says about him is that there was not a single area of Torah that he did not know. He knew every part of Torah, as we say, Kol HaTorah Kula. He knew the entire Torah. I'll read the words of Masechah Sofrim. Shelo hiniach parsha achas b'Torah shelo lamda. There was no parsha, no section of Torah that he didn't learn. And he studied Mikra and Targum, which is the interpretation, all the Medrash, all the Halacha, all the Agados. He learned it all. And one time he said, here's a quote that he once said, Im yihiyu kol hashamayim yirios. If all of the heavens were parchment, v'kol ha'ilanos kulmosin, and all the trees in the world were quills to write, v'kol hayamim dio, and all of the oceans ink. So if all the oceans were ink, and all the trees were quills for pens, and all of the heavens were parchment upon which to write, einon kidai lichtov es chachmasi shelamadti merabos, that would not be sufficient to write down all the wisdom that I gained from my teachers. Again, giving credit to his teachers. The wisdom I gained from my teachers could not be written down, even if the entire world was an ink, were ink, pens, and parchment. And then he adds, "V'lo yatzalti michachmasan elo kashem shehazvuv hazu hatoivelas b'yam hagadol u'mashu hu machzar." And this which I gained from my teachers, how much of their wisdom did I gain? The amount that a fly that goes into the ocean comes up, the amount of water that it brings up from the ocean. That's the amount of wisdom from my sages that I've gained. So after saying that the wisdom he said that he's gained, he couldn't be written with all the parchment in the world, he then says, and the wisdom I have is just like that of a fly. The point is, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was someone who knew all of Torah. And therefore, when he says, if you've learned a lot of Torah, don't take too much credit, he has the right to say it because he learned a lot of Torah. He's the one who knew all of the Torah. While we're at it, I want to share what the Talmud speaks about the qualities of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The Gemara, this is Tractate Sukkah, 28a, says like this. If you want to know the qualities, and I'm not just sharing this so that we learn the qualities of someone, I'm sharing this for two reasons. One reason is because these are qualities that we should try to emulate. Secondly, when we appreciate his qualities, we can appreciate why he became such an important figure at a turning point in Jewish history. It's not just a random person who found himself in the right place at the right time. He's a person of tremendous quality. Here's what this Gemara says about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Yochanan ben Zakkai, miyamav lo siach chulin, sichas chulin. Throughout his entire lifetime, he never spoke mundane talk. There was never a wasteful conversation. Every conversation he had in his life was meaningful and holy, meaningful conversation. He never walked 4 cubits without Torah and without tefillin. No one ever came to the Beis HaMedrash before he did. He was the first one there. He never slept in the Beis Medrash. Not a major sleep nor a small nap. Part of the great joys of Judaism is people to fall asleep during the rabbi's sermon. He never slept in the Beis Medrash. Not a deep sleep, not a light sleep. And interesting, he never thought about Torah in inappropriate places. That was when he went. That's an interesting quality, but he never thought about Torah when he was walking through dirty places. He never left the base medrash while someone was there. In other words, he was the last one out. Whenever a person found him, he was studying. So far, we see the qualities of Torah study, commitment to Torah study. But now we see some of his qualities as a human being. He was the one who opened the door for his students to come into base medrash. So he made sure to, it's one thing to be committed to Torah study, but to have the humility to open the door for his students, that was him. He never shared something which he did not hear from his teacher. So everything he taught, he had heard from his teachers. You see all sorts of qualities coming together. The only time he told his students, it's time to get up and leave, were Erev Pesach and Erev Yom Kippur. Those are the 2 times in the year. Otherwise, he taught, and if people left, they left. The 2 times he said, okay, now it's time to go home. And that was Erev Pesach, you got to go home for the Seder. And Erev Yom Kippur, you got to get ready, you got to go home to eat in order to fast. Okay. So this is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the great teachers and one of these great scholars of tremendous quality. And what he says is, I have his message that he would say again and again is, study a lot of Torah, but don't become arrogant because of it. Because the study of Torah is why you are here. Fine. Now, let's talk about the next Mishnah. In the text I sent out today, I said, who are the 6 people who helped Judaism in its most difficult time? And while that may not be perfectly accurate, but you'll see why I said 6. First number, the next Mishnah, or in some places it's the same Mishnah. Chamisha Talmidim hayu loy l'Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 students. Now this may be a little bit surprising. How is it that a teacher of such quality would only have 5 students? And the answer is, he didn't just have 5 students. He had hundreds, probably thousands of students. But he had 5 students that became his successors. He was 5 students to whom he passed on his Torah wisdom, that they became the next chain, in the next link in the chain of Torah. Who else, let me put a little Jewish trivia out here, who else was known to have 5 students? I know of two great sages that come to mind.
Ben Uziel.
Who's that?
Yohanan ben Uziel.
Rabbi Yochanan ben Uziel? Yonatan?
Yes.
Okay, could be. Yonatan. I don't know. That's not one of the names that came to mind, but possibly. One name that comes to mind is Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, first he had 24,000 students, but after 24,000 students died, it said he then took 5 students afterwards. So he had 5 students of Rabbi Akiva. One of them was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Those are his 5 students. And the same idea, he had many students, but these 5 became his, so to say, the successors of his wisdom. And then another such person is the Arizal. It says the Arizal had 5 primary students. In fact, I understand that the Arizal's 5 students were all named Chaim. The most famous is Rabbi Chaim Vital. But the Arizal had 5 students as well. Now, if you go to Tiberia, there's the caver of the Rambam, the burial place of the Rambam, Maimonides, and right next to the burial place of Maimonides is the burial place of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his 5 students. They're all that's right there, the same location. So you have the 5 students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. I want to share one idea, that Chamisha Talmidim hayu loy l'Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So one, I think it's what is it? Where did I see this? Chamisha Talmidim hayu loy l'Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says the Medrash Shmuel. Says, what do you mean, Chamisha? What about, why 5 students? They had many students. So he says, a key word over here is loy. In Hebrew, lamed vav, or lo. Lo l'Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. That word is extra. The word lo is extra, right? Lo over here, lamed vav, means what? How would you translate the word lo? To him. Well, what if it would just say Chamisha Talmidim Hayu Li Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? Same exact translation, right? 5 students there were to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The word lo is extra. Once you say lo li Rabbi, we know it's Rabbi, that it was to him. So it says the Medrash Shmuel something very interesting. He says the word lo implies that benefits him. He compares that to the words lech lecha, go to you, which was the beginning of the Parshas Lech Lecha. Lo means to your benefit. So he says Yochanan ben Zakkai had thousands of students, but he had 5 students that were lo to his benefit. He had 5 students that benefited him, because we have a statement which we say Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Chanina says that I learned a lot from my teachers. I learned even more from my colleagues, and I learned the most from my students. Mitalmida yosem mikula. A beautiful statement. Rabbi Chanina says, I learned from my teachers, I learned a lot. From my colleagues, I learned even more. Umitalmida yosem mikula. And from my students, I learned even more. That the most I learned from my students. But the Medrash Shmuel points out that's not true about all students. The idea that you learn the most from your students is not true about every student to person, especially someone who teaches many, many people. It's not true about all students. It's only true about certain ones. Those that sharpen you, those that challenge you, those that you really that make you work hard. You know, when someone the ones who challenge what you're teaching, that's the ones from whom you gain the most. So it says in Medrash Shmuel, that idea that you gain from some students is what's being alluded to over here. Chamisha Talmidim, he had 5 students. How you lo? There were 5 students who benefited their teacher, who challenged him and who sharpened him. These 5 were the ones who really who benefited him the most. And who are these 5 students? Let's read through them. The Eluhain. They are Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkins, Rabbi Eliezer the son of Horkins, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya, Rabbi Yeshua the son of Chananya, Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Yossi the Kohen, Rabbi Shimon ben Nisanel, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. Shimon ben Nisanel and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. All right, I see we're not gonna have that much more time on this, so I want to pause over here because the next statement in the Mishnah is where he shares the quality of each of the 5, and that'll take up the rest of the time. I want to get a little bit to the historical significance of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his students. So, firstly, we have this idea of 5 students, which we started talking about, and the Rebbe points out in his Sichas, he says that in the Medrash it compares Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to Moshe Rabbeinu. We find the comparison between Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to Moshe Rabbeinu. What's the comparison? So we already said one comparison is that both Jewish people through a very critical point. Moshe led them out of Egypt, led them to the border of Israel. Yochanan ben Zakkai led them through the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, of the second Beis Hamikdash. But the Sifri says other comparisons between Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Moshe Rabbeinu. What were the other comparisons? Says the Sifri. Both Moshe Rabbeinu and Yochanan ben Zakkai would anyone care to guess what the comparisons would be? Trying to keep everyone awake so we don't, like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, don't fall asleep in the base medrash. What could be a comparison between Moshe Rabbeinu and Yochanan ben Zakkai? This is a difficult question. I don't know if I would have guessed any of these on my own either.
Humbleness.
Okay. That would be a good one. That's not one that the Medrash gives. Humility. It's more of technical similarities. So it says like this. Both lived till 120. Guess you wouldn't know that unless you studied the Gemara about Yochanan ben Zakkai. Both lived till 120. By the way, there is a very fascinating description in the Talmud of the passing of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. We'll get to that some other time. Either way, both lived till 120. And of that 120 years, you can divide the time into 3 groups of 40. How so? So this is according to one understanding of the history of Moshe Rabbeinu. According to the Medrash, according to the Sifri, Moshe Rabbeinu was in Egypt for 40 years and Midian for 40 years. Right? We know that Moshe ran to Midian. That's where he met his wife. We don't know exactly how long he was there for. There's different opinions as to how long he was there for. We know he came back 1 year before they left Egypt. So according to the Sifri, he was in Egypt for 40 years, Midian for 40 years, and the last 40 years of his life in the desert. That we know for sure. And it's that last 40 years of his life where he took care of the Jewish people. And the Sifri says the same is true with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. For the first 40 years of his life, he was involved in business. The next 40 years of his life, he was Shimesh Chachamim. Then he was a student, and he was an attendant to the sages that he learned from. And it's the last 40 years of his life that he took care of people. He was the leader, but more than just a leader, he guided them and helped them. Correct. Rabbi Akiva also, we have lived to 120. Yes. Yes. But he says, so the Rebbe takes it a step further, and he says that just as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 students, in other words, he had 5 outlets to which he passed on his wisdom, and that's another point that is made, is that the five students, each, he was able to convey a different part of Torah to each of them. Moshe Rabbeinu also had 5 outlets to which he shared Torah wisdom. It's not students, but rather 5 books, otherwise known as the 5 books of Moses. So Moshe Rabbeinu also, he shared his wisdom in the book of Bereshit, Shemos, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim. And the Rebbe even goes on to say, I'm not going to get into this now, the Rebbe goes on to point out how each of the students, or Yochanan ben Zakkai, parallels one of the 5 books of Torah. Lezer Agadol is Bereshit, Rishua is Shemos, Shimon Yosef HaKohen is Vayikra. So there's 5 and 5, so we see these parallels between Moshe Rabbeinu and Yochanan ben Zakkai. What is the history of Yochanan ben Zakkai? So I'm going to share something which you may know, but I think it's worth sharing because it tells us about the significance of him and these students. Yochanan ben Zakkai lived at the time of the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, and at that time the Romans were so what are we talking about? The year 70 of the Common Era, and the Romans that surrounded Yerushalayim, surrounded Jerusalem. And although we are well aware of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, what's less known, but what the Talmud tells us very clearly, is that there was internal strife, which really was equally important, played an equal role in the destruction of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. And there was the Jewish people. You had the vigilantes, is probably a better word, that wanted to battle against the Romans, and you had the sages who really felt that they were not going to be victorious in the battle against the Romans. Those Bar Yoneh, there's the name, the Talmudic term, Bar Yoneh, you call it the thugs, or those who wanted to go to war. They felt that they were like the second coming of the Maccabees. They said, well, a few hundred years ago, the Maccabees were able to withstand the massive Greek army, so we could withstand the massive Roman army. The sages recognized that it wasn't meant to be, and the situation was different, and therefore they felt that they should make some sort of peace treaty with the Romans, but they couldn't because of this army on the inside of Jews who did not allow it. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was one who felt that he kind of saw the writing on the wall and saw that Jerusalem would be destroyed. And therefore he felt, okay, at this point I got to start planning for post-Jerusalem Judaism, post-Temple Judaism. And so he wanted to meet up with the Romans to kind of make arrangements, but he couldn't get out of Jerusalem because they weren't allowing it. There was 2 rings around Jerusalem. There was the external ring of the Roman army. There was the internal ring of the Jewish army who did not allow anyone out. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had a nephew, I believe, who was one of the leaders of the Jewish army, the Jewish rebellion movement. His name was Abba Sikra. So Yochanan ben Zakkai had a meeting with Abba Sikra, and he says, your war you're gonna lose your war. Your battle is futile. There's no chance of victory. And a very fascinating response, Abba Sikra said, yeah, I know that, but there's nothing I can do about it, because if I at this point try to convince my army to give up arms, they'll kill me. No, and I think there's a lot of, often in history this happens, is that a person can get caught up in a movement that at some point they realize is incorrect, but they're too heavily tied to it. Brings us back to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, accepting from Hillel and Shammai. Listen to all sides and be a receiver of all sides. So the point is, Abba Sikra says, it's true, you're right, I agree with you, but there's nothing I can do because I am too tied to my army, who are and being an army, they'll kill anyone in order to further their goal. It was that, not the temple, so it was that group that destroyed the stockpile of food in Jerusalem so that they would be forced to go to war. Yes. So Yochanan ben Zakkai devises a plan that only 4 people know about. A very risky plan, one that is the one that is life threatening for sure. And that is that he would smuggle himself out of Jerusalem by pretending to be dead. And there were 4 people who knew of this plan. And then he could arrange for a meeting with the general on the other side of the Romans. The 4 people who knew of this plan were him, Abba Sikra, that the man on the other side who we knew, the man part of the Jewish rebellious group, as well as 2 of his students, the first 2 that are mentioned here. And that is Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Hoshua. And he says to them, and he plans this out. This is the earliest formation of the Mossad, perhaps. And he plans it out, so he starts by feigning sickness. You can't just suddenly die, that's certainly suspicious. Feigning illness, and then he dies, quote unquote. And now, one of the rules about Yerushalayim, very fascinating rule, is that part of the holiness of Jerusalem is that nobody's buried in Jerusalem. Right outside Yerushalayim, you have Har HaZeisim, which is maybe the most famous Jewish cemetery. That's outside. So they have to leave Yerushalayim. So the 2 students are aware. So Yeshua and Gamliel, Shua and Eliezer, that is, are the ones who are carrying the body or closest to the body. And as they are about to leave the city walls, that's the one thing that the Jewish army has to let them through, the army is suspicious. And so they say, you know what, if he's really dead, then there won't be a problem to stab him, right? That's a problem, right? Houston, we have a problem. So that's where Abba Sikra steps in. And Abba Sikra turns to them and says, the Romans are watching us. Could you imagine if they see that we stab one of our leaders? Well, that will embolden them. They'll say that there's total chaos among the Jewish people. There's irreverence. There's civil war. If they see that, they'll understand that we're at odds with one another, and that'll give them a reason to attack. Or that'll embolden them, give them strength. We don't want to do that. So they said another thing, maybe we could do something else with the body. And again, Abba Sikra said the same thing. We don't want to give the enemy any advantage right now. And any disrespect we show to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is the leader, or one of the leaders of the Jewish people, will give them a sign that there's something wrong on the inside. So therefore, let him go. And that's what happens. They let him go through. And again, I encourage you to read the Talmud talks about this. I'm sure you can find it easily online. Talmud Tractate Gittin talks about how he meets someone who ends up being Vespasian, and there's a whole conversation. And he proves himself, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai proves himself in a unique way to be of having divine knowledge. And then he turns to Vespasian, he says, I have 3 requests of you. He says, I want you to, the most significant one, which is relevant to our conversation, is I want you to spare Yavna. I want you to spare the city of Yavna, which is a city, I think it's north of Yerushalayim, and so that we can go there and establish a Torah center, because I know that you're going to be victorious over Jerusalem, and when Jerusalem is destroyed, and Jerusalem is the center of Jewish life, I want there to be a center of Torah study outside of Jerusalem the sages can go to. And that's one of the requests, and Vespasian grants that request. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai then, I believe, goes from there to Yavna and sets up a Torah center there, a center of Torah study. And that becomes, a few years later, the temple is indeed destroyed. Now, during those few years, the sages are upset with Yochanan ben Zakkai. Why are you deflecting to another city? Why are you going somewhere else where there's Yerushalayim remains the capital. And God will, why are we giving up on Yerushalayim? But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had the foresight to see what the Jewish people needed. And so he, along with these two students, and then the other students, were the ones who rebuilt Judaism when Judaism was destroyed. And again, it's not, we talk about the destruction of the temple. It's much more than just the destruction of the temple that happens. It's the destruction of the temple. It's the death of hundreds of thousands of people. It's many, perhaps tens, if not hundreds of thousands others that go into slavery. It's the decimation of Judaism, not just the Holy Temple, that happens at the destruction of the Second Temple. I think until the Holocaust, the most tragic and the greatest death that ever occurred, event that ever occurred with most tragic Jewish people, was the destruction of the Second Temple, surpassed by the Holocaust 80 years ago. So Yochanan ben Zakkai takes these two students and then rebuilds Judaism after the destruction of the temple, because he had the foresight beforehand that there should be a home that they should go to. And that's the significance of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his students. And when we understand this, God willing, as we continue this conversation next week and delve into who these personalities were, specifically the first one, Rabbi Elazar ben Hyrcanus, who himself has a fascinating life story, then we can appreciate their identity. We can appreciate the qualities that he gives to them, which he enumerates at the end of this Mishnah, which we just started. And then we could go on to the next Mishnah, which each of these students shares some life advice for all of us to carry with us. So we'll probably spend a few weeks on this, but thank you all for joining this class. And I look forward to continuing our studies, God willing, next Thursday, continuing this Mishnah.